They scrutinized her ID, questioned her right to be there, and even summoned security, completely unaware that the person they were turning away was the very individual who could upend their entire career with a single phone call. The thought of going undercover in her own bank had gnawed at Danielle Grayson for months. It began as a fleeting notion, almost a daydream, but the more she considered it, the more determined she grew to see how her policies truly worked or failed in real life. As the founder and CEO of Grayson Trust, Danielle had poured her heart into shaping an institution she believed could be different from the usual big bank experience, fair, non-judgmental, and respectful to everyone. Yet rumors persisted that not every branch lived up to those ideals. She tried ignoring those rumors. After all, she had hammered out countless anti-bias and customer service policies, demanded rigorous training programs, and personally signed off on an internal oversight system meant to keep every employee accountable. But in the back of her mind, she knew that the best rules in the world are only as strong as the people enforcing them, and if certain staff members thought they could get away with ignoring or bending those rules, perhaps letting their personal biases slip in, then her dream of a truly fair bank was in trouble. She needed proof one way or the other. She couldn't get that proof in a fancy suit, announced by a small entourage. So she opted for anonymity. One ordinary afternoon, she picked out a plain cardigan, a simple pair of jeans, and sneakers, not the usual polished attire that screamed executive. She grabbed a modest handbag, drove a practical car, and pulled into the parking lot of a Grayson Trust branch located in Indianapolis. Danielle remembered approving this particular site about 3 years ago, excited about bringing her vision to a growing neighborhood. She could still recall the ribbon-cutting ceremony, her handshake with the local manager, the applause of local residents, the short speech about inclusivity and banking with heart. Today she walked in unrecognized, no gold name tag, no professional greeting. Just an unknown face in the crowd. The automatic doors slid open, bringing her into a typical bank environment, a clean foyer, bright fluorescent lighting, and the faint mixture of fresh paper and industrial-grade cleaning solutions. A handful of customers waited in short lines, while a few sat in chairs by the windows, reading forms or tapping at their phones. One teller, a young woman with a stiff ponytail, barely glanced up from her station. Danielle straightened her shoulders, took a deep breath, and picked that teller's line. She wanted to see exactly how the staff would treat an unassuming customer requesting everyday bank services. When it was her turn, she stepped up to the window, calmly offering a small polite, "Hello, I'd like to make a withdrawal." The teller didn't smile or greet her back, only shoved a slip of paper and a pen across the counter. "Fill this out," came the curt instruction. Nothing particularly rude in that alone. Some employees had more mechanical approaches, but Danielle noted the lack of any personal warmth or typical pleasantries. She took the pen, filled in her name, Danielle Grayson, though she didn't expect that to ring any bells, her account number, and the amount $5,000. She'd deliberately chosen this sum because it was significant enough to test the staff's reaction, but well within the balance of that account. She slid the form back alongside her driver's license. The teller's eyes flicked down to the license, then to the slip, then back up at Danielle. Something intangible changed in the teller's expression, like a hidden switch was flipped. The teller's lips tightened, and she paused. It wasn't the normal check to ensure everything matched, it was more like suspicion creeping over her face. Danielle felt an inward jolt. This was exactly what she had feared. In any normal scenario, the teller would verify the ID in a matter of seconds, check the account in the computer system, confirm the balance, and hand over the money. But instead, the young woman pressed her lips into a thin line, lifted Danielle's license off the counter, and said, "I'll be right back." Without explanation, she hurried off, disappearing through a door near the back. Seconds stretched into a minute, then 2, then 5. Customers milled about behind Danielle, some glancing at her sympathetically, others ignoring the tension altogether. The air carried the quiet hum of typical bank chatter, but her place at the counter felt oddly spotlighted. She recognized the pattern. The teller had decided Danielle didn't look like someone who could withdraw that much money, or she was suspicious for some personal reason. Danielle's nerves tingled with the sense that all her hunches about staff biases were being confirmed right now, in real time. Finally, the teller returned. She wasn't alone. A middle-aged man, somewhat stout with rimless glasses and a name tag reading, Todd Larson, branch manager, walked beside her, adopting a polished professional smile that didn't reach his eyes. He approached slowly, as if bracing for conflict. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he said. "I hear you're trying to make a withdrawal." Danielle nodded. "Yes, I wrote it on the form. $5,000. Todd glanced at the teller, then at the ID in his hand, then up at Danielle's face. "Mind if I look at your identification?" he asked, though he already held it. He examined it under the light, flipping it over. She realized he was stalling, likely searching for some reason to refuse her. Then in a too casual tone, he asked, "So Miss Grayson, is this your first time banking here?" Instantly she knew what he was implying. "No," she answered, fighting the tension in her voice. "I've had an account with Grayson Trust here since the day this branch opened." He gave a slow, exaggerated nod. "I see," he murmured, the emphasis making it sound like he didn't believe her. "And you want $5,000 in cash." Danielle caught how customers behind her began fidgeting, aware that something was off. "That's right," she said, tone measured. "You can see in your system I have plenty of funds." For a split second, Todd seemed to weigh how far he'd push. Then in a carefully rehearsed voice, he said, "Unfortunately we can't process this right now. We're unable to verify the transaction." A surge of quiet anger coursed through her. "Unable to verify?" she asked. Eyebrows raised. "But you have my ID, my account number, and a positive balance. What do you still need?" Todd pressed his lips together. "We have to follow certain protocols. If we suspect anything unusual, we need further confirmation." Her heart pounded, but she kept a serene exterior. This wasn't about protocol. She recognized that well enough. Yet she forced out a polite question, "And what might be unusual about me asking for my own money?" He paused, glancing at the teller, then lowered his voice. "Let's just say we want to make sure everything is legitimate." She let out a controlled breath. "I see." In that moment, Todd signaled subtly to the side, and an armed security guard, broad shoulders, belt heavy with standard gear, stepped forward. That took it from exasperating to outrageous. They were effectively calling in security on a suspected fraudulent transaction from someone with valid ID. For an instant, Danielle wanted to snap. But she had come here to see the truth, and here it was, unfolding in front of her. She turned her phone's camera on, ignoring how Todd stiffened. "I need this on record," she said, her voice calm. The security guard drew closer, as though bracing to escort her out. Todd looked unsettled, but tried to stay controlled. Danielle pointed the camera not just at Todd, but at the guard, letting them realize every movement was being recorded. Then Todd made the final, damning misstep. Still gripping Danielle's ID, he refused to hand it back, as if he, not she, had ultimate say over what happened next. She let him do it, let him stand there with her license in his hand for a few seconds, and then in a measured voice, she told him, "Todd, you might want to check your system more thoroughly before you make your final decision." He blinked, confusion crossing his features, but she calmly retrieved the ID from him, flipping it so he could see the name again. In the hush that fell, she said, "I'm Danielle Grayson, founder, majority shareholder, and CEO of this bank." It was as though a spotlight had hit Todd. He froze, color draining from his face. The teller let out a small, involuntary gasp. The security guard dropped his gaze, uncertain how to proceed now that he realized who he was about to remove from the premises. Danielle slipped her ID into her bag. She explained, calmly but with an unmistakable edge, that she had personally approved the budget for this branch, that she had hammered out the customer service policies Todd was flouting, that she had insisted on anti-discrimination clauses in the staff manuals, clauses Todd and the teller had just broken in front of her. The manager looked like he might collapse from shock. He attempted to sputter out, "Miss Grayson, I had no idea. This was just a security measure." She gave him a chillingly polite smile. "Is that so?" The customers in the lobby, who had been quietly watching, realized that a major revelation was unfolding. Some quietly took out their phones, possibly filming. Because from where I stand, Danielle continued, it looks an awful lot like you assumed I didn't fit your idea of who can withdraw $5,000. And instead of checking your records, you went straight for intimidation. You tried to deny a legitimate transaction. Todd tried to gather himself. I promise, it's not what it looks like. I can process it now. Please like and subscribe, and check out my channel. For more stories subscribe. Let's get back to the story. Her eyebrows rose. Now, she echoed. Now that you know my position, it's suddenly acceptable. She allowed the question to hang in the air. For a few heartbeats, nobody spoke. The manager's face turned a blotchy red. At last, Todd choked out, I sincerely apologize, Miss Grayson. There was a misunderstanding. Let's fix this right away. He signaled the teller, who hastily began counting out the $5,000, hands trembling. Danielle glanced at the security guard, who looked more than ready to disappear. She said nothing to him, letting him stew in the recognition that he'd nearly manhandled the founder of the entire bank. When the teller, cheeks burning, handed Danielle the envelope of cash, Danielle took it and carefully placed it in her bag. Then she addressed the entire room in a voice loud enough for everyone to catch. I built Grayson Trust to be a bank that respects and welcomes all. If this is how you treat a random person with valid ID, I hate to think how you handle those who can't speak up for themselves. The hush that followed was deafening, every employee realizing they'd become part of a cautionary tale. The manager started stammering, Ma'am, Miss Grayson, we never intended. But she held up a hand. That's enough. I'll handle this from here. Don't be surprised if corporate calls you in for a meeting very soon. She took out a business card, placed it on the counter in front of Todd. Actually, I'll see to it personally. He nodded in abject submission, well aware that he'd just jeopardized his entire career. The teller stared at her desk, refusing to meet Danielle's gaze. The security guard stood uncertainly, not sure if he should remain at the manager's side or escort Danielle to the door. Danielle spared him a glance, but said nothing. She turned on her heel, walking toward the exit. She could feel the tension in the air. An entire staff's world had just been upended. She paused at the door, looking over her shoulder. Oh, and Todd? She said, quietly. He looked up from the business card, eyes full of dread. She gave him a small knowing smile. Next time, verify your facts before denying someone their rights. It'll save everyone a lot of trouble. He swallowed thickly. Yes, Miss Grayson, he mumbled. She left, stepping into the crisp air outside. The adrenaline lingered, but she felt calm. There was no sense of personal triumph in humiliating him. If anything, it confirmed her worst suspicion that some employees used their positions to impose bias and discrimination under the guise of policy. That knowledge hurt, yet it also gave her a path forward. She had seen the problem firsthand, so she could fix it from the top. The repercussions came swiftly. Within 24 hours, Danielle convened an emergency meeting at Grayson Trust's headquarters. She told her executives exactly what had transpired, how the manager singled her out, demanded bizarre extra verification, refused to accept her ID, and called security. Nods and gasps circled the table as staff realized it was more than just a fiasco. It was a direct violation of the bank's stated mission. Immediately, HR launched a formal investigation into the entire branch's operations. Training materials were re-examined, and interviews were conducted with employees, from the manager down to part-time tellers. Danielle herself oversaw part of the inquiry, to ensure no one could hide or spin the facts. The manager, Todd, was placed on indefinite suspension, pending the final result. Meanwhile, Danielle prepared to speak with staff across multiple branches, to ensure this wasn't just localized, that no other employees harbored similar biases. Within weeks, changes rippled through Grayson Trust. Workshops were scheduled for unconscious bias and equitable customer service. The bank's code of conduct was updated with tighter accountability measures, no more empty slogans about inclusivity. Instead, they introduced real consequences if staff mistreated or harassed a customer. Danielle visited other branches unannounced, speaking to employees without the usual formality, ensuring they truly believed in the new approach. She welcomed honest feedback, and even apologized to staff members who had long recognized hidden prejudices in certain corners of the organization. News of her disguised bank visit spread quietly among employees. Some admired her for personally investigating a rumor. Others felt uneasy. If they had any questionable tendencies, they worried they'd be next. But Danielle pressed on, convinced that an institution only thrives when it constantly checks its own blind spots. Those who wanted a fair, welcoming bank embraced the new initiatives. Those with outsized egos or deep biases found themselves on shaky ground. In that Indianapolis branch specifically, many employees realized that day had changed everything. The teller who first walked off with Danielle's ID apologized in tears during a follow-up meeting, admitting she had made assumptions about Danielle's capacity to withdraw such an amount. She faced disciplinary measures, yes, but also a second chance if she completed extensive retraining and showed genuine improvement in how she interacted with customers. Meanwhile, Todd's indefinite suspension soon became a dismissal. The investigating team uncovered a pattern of unfair practices under his watch. Minorities and women requesting more than small sums frequently found themselves unable to verify, or asked for more ID, or quietly directed to see the manager. Instances that had never been fully reported but stacked up once people realized they weren't alone. Returning to that same branch a month later, Danielle wore her usual professional attire. This time, the staff recognized her immediately, greeting her with a level of politeness bordering on nervous awe. She sensed a fundamental shift in the atmosphere. The new manager, someone with a proven track record for fairness, introduced her to staff members, eager to demonstrate that the changes mandated from corporate were fully in progress. She engaged in quiet conversation, praising them when they showed sincerity, cautioning them if she sensed any lingering prejudice. While the improvement felt promising, she kept reminding everyone, real transformation required ongoing vigilance. A single memo or retraining session wouldn't fix an ingrained bias. They needed consistent follow-up, and the willingness to confront any colleague who slipped into old patterns. And most importantly, they needed to reassure every customer walking in the door that no matter how they looked, how they dressed, or how much money they sought to withdraw, they'd receive the same courtesy and respect. As for Danielle, the day stuck with her. She often reflected on how easily the staff had tried to dismiss her, someone simply not dressed to their assumptions, and how quickly that small act of prejudice ballooned into hostility. She recognized that had she not been the CEO, many others might simply have walked away empty-handed and humiliated, with no recourse. That thought drove her to expand a formal complaint and resolution process for customers. She wanted phone lines, online portals and in-person forms that let people escalate issues straight to the corporate oversight team if they felt singled out or mistreated. By the end of her push, employees realized this wasn't a short-term storm, but a long-term pivot in culture. In official memos, Danielle explained that if employees doubted her seriousness, they needed only recall what happened in Indianapolis. Tellers and managers across the network quietly improved how they greeted customers, validated IDs, or responded to suspicious transactions. Some who felt uneasy about these changes left on their own, saying they disliked the micromanagement. Danielle considered that an acceptable outcome. She had no interest in retaining staff who balked at fundamental courtesy. From the customer's perspective, after a short period of confusion and readjustment, the difference at Grace and Trust branches became obvious. People of all backgrounds noticed the staff's new openness and willingness to explain transactions politely, without leaps to suspicion. Word of mouth praised how the CEO personally ensured these higher standards, even championing a new tagline about where trust meets respect. The story of the disguised CEO who tested her own bank spread quietly. Many saw it as a sign that Grace and Trust meant what it said about accountability. In the end, Danielle didn't regret enduring that humiliating moment at the counter, where the staff had denied her withdrawal and tried to call security. Her frustration had turned into an opportunity for exposing the real problems and forging solutions. In a sense, the fiasco was the best impetus for real change. She found solace in the fact that if it could happen to her, it was definitely happening to customers every day who couldn't fight back so effectively. Now hopefully no one else would face that kind of belittling experience at a Grace and Trust branch. Ultimately, Danielle continued her quiet visits to random branches in different regions, never again announcing her presence. Sometimes she'd step in at odd hours, wearing casual clothes, speaking with employees, or watching them greet other customers. It became a personal mission, verifying that the environment she had envisioned on Grace and Trust's founding day matched the day-to-day reality. Each time she left feeling confident or concerned, she'd feed that insight back to the corporate leadership, ensuring that no corner of her bank ever again repeated the fiasco Todd had orchestrated. Looking back on it all, Danielle recognized that one confrontation had done more to open eyes within the bank than dozens of lengthy memos and training courses. Employees realized that behind any mundane request, behind any plain cardigan or unremarkable appearance, there could be a client as significant as the CEO herself. And that lesson, driven home by the unbelievably high stakes of nearly dismissing their own founder, anchored a new respect across Grace and Trust. Treat everyone fairly, because you never truly know who stands before you, nor the power they might hold to improve or upend your life. If you've ever been treated differently or doubted for no valid reason, remember Danielle's experience. Don't hesitate to speak out, document the injustice, and seek those in power who'll rectify it. Sometimes real change happens when one person refuses to let an institution forget its promise of fairness, and demands that it finally lives up to its own name.